Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani talking about our newest episode of The White Lotus. And so, I'm beginning to think like it's sort of nice and maybe comforting that it's similar storylines. Now you've got kind of the grifter men who are meeting the group of friends. I don't know why the group of friends is not the storyline there's nothing but narcissism there. But I'll start there to get them out of the way because they're the least interesting part of the story to me. I think that the meaty narcissism stuff is living in the other stories. With those three women, we really, I don't think it's fair to sort of comment on it as just mild narcissism. I think there's something heavier. It is interesting that I think her name is Jacqueline, the woman who is hurt by her partner's unavailability, who then feels the compulsion to act out, not be vulnerable, but to act out. And then they go to the hotel that has the less than elite guests, though that's the kind of hotel I would have stayed in, but the less than elite people staying at it, and she's sort of repulsed by it. I did find that to be a narcissistic maneuver. Narcissistic people who are young and sort of hot, they do find some offense in being with people who aren't so glam fab, however that's constructed for them. These three women are so ridiculous and so vapid and so superficial and so triangulaty, but it all feels like this kind of like mild to moderate narcissism, not even worth mentioning about. I'm glad they're not my friends and I don't like them. So let's just leave it at that. Now, the family. This family is like, again, this is where we get our sort of our toxic family system in this episode of White Lotus. The dynamic that really jumped out at me, and I'm sure any of you who watched it, was the intrusiveness, like those really messed up, teasing boundaries that really start to skirt bullying, right? Now, Saxon, who maybe is kind of a golden child-ish, but more than anything, he's definitely sort of the narcissistic heir in the making. Like, he will definitely go on to be a narcissistic adult. He already is. But there's a meanness to him, and there's a teasing to him, and there's a constant devaluing and belittling of his siblings. Any one of you who has a narcissistic sibling, you picked up on these patterns probably by adolescence, and then they were in full-fledged, by the time you were in emerging adulthood, into adulthood. And you can see that the younger brother is kind of coming under the sway of this brother that he is very ambivalent about, not unusual in narcissistic sibling situations, but like, again, really poor boundaries. I'm going to run the blender. I'm going to force you to drink this thing. Narcissistic family systems and forcing you to eat and drink things you don't want is very much a classical part of it. Taking her book, making fun of the sister. It's just that constant intrusiveness. And throw onto there that brother Saxon also is sexually compulsive. It all tracks with narcissism. There's also, there's a really interesting scene, perfect gaslighting scene of, dad's obviously falling apart. He's, an unethical business person, big surprise. He's got this sort of mildly narcissistic, completely checked out, I would say moderately, she could be moderately narcissistic too, checked out wife. With each episode, that severity dial seems to be turning up. But in his case, what's fascinating is watching him gaslight her, and he's stealing his wife's lorazepam, her anti-anxiety medication, her pills. And then when he takes them from her purse or bag, he tells her that maybe you didn't bring them and that you're always losing things. I was like, that's it. Perfect gaslighting. Not only is he denying that, obviously he took them, he's not going to tell her that, but not only is that, he goes on and says, you didn't bring them, and then throws on top of that, you're always losing things. That's just such a great example of classical gaslighting and what that can look like. The other storyline that really holds my interest is the vulnerable narcissistic guy who has the young British girlfriend. That's a really meaty narcissistic story, because what they're doing a fantastic job there of depicting is how vulnerable narcissism shows up. It's actually a very nuanced storyline. I always sit up straight when that storyline is playing out. He clearly went through, the guy who feels sociopathic and vulnerably narcissistic and unhinged. He clearly went through an early life loss and trauma, which has shaped his entire life. But every so often with that character, you see his vulnerability come out. For example, when he talks to to the therapist, the Indian woman who he met as sort of as a trauma therapist, mindfulness therapist, whatever she was at the hotel. But even with the girlfriend, and the girlfriend is sort of, again, his glints of vulnerability come out. I've worked with clients like this in therapy, and the glints kind of come out like you're like, there it is, there it is. But it kind of, it's like those sea anemones. You touch them and they pull right in. You get too close to it, and then that vulnerability is going to pop right back. But it can help us understand why people do attach to folks like this. Even that, the young woman's probably in it for the money, but you could see why a person gets drawn to it, because in those moments, there's a softening of this person. There seems to be a possibility. She's an interesting partner to him because clearly, I mean, she's in it for the money. And she co-manipulates with him. She starts crying. So he tends to sort of shut her down and invalidate her. She gets what she wants by doing things like crying and it works. It plays again to this vulnerability in him. At times, though, she soothes him. There was a scene in the boat where she throws her arms around him when he shares, how upset he is about what happened to his father and why he's going to Bangkok. And her response to that was very interesting because it was sort of what many survivors would do if they had such an invalidating partner, that she threw her arms around him. So again, there's so much nuance in that story. I really tip my hat to the writers and the producers on that one, because it's being told in a way that's actually kind of, very realistic, right? And he responds to it too. You can see a softening in him once again. But what's a classical part of vulnerable narcissism is he's really, really holding on to this grievance. Now, it's not an unreasonable grievance, right? He feels as though his father was taken away from him by a very cruel man whose father was only trying to do good in the world, and he believes this person killed his father, so he never got his father, and he tracks all of the problems he's had in his life to this loss of his father, that he could have been a better man had this not happened. So he wants to confront the man who did this. And so that begs the question, is he going to be violent? Is he going to be, do something that will have permanent ramifications for his life? So having a grievance, holding anger against someone, that's not unusual and quite normal. But the way he's holding on to it, like it's become his single life sort of mission, and his entire narrative of his life is stuck in that. That's a very common through line we see with people who are vulnerably narcissistic. And when we work with clients who have vulnerable narcissistic patterns, it's kind of the work is helping loosen them from that narrative, which is, I think, what the therapist lady was trying to do in the hotel. Anyhow, I think it's a really powerful storyline. And even I find myself kind of strangely trauma bonded to that man, because I'm like, oh, I can see if we did the work with you, we could get you there. But then I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so mean. So you can see, again, whoever that actor is doing a great job, because we keep getting that push-pull with him. There was also a little throwaway line, that superficial idea. I just had to grab it because it was a narcissistic thing, where the transactional girlfriend of Greg and the young British woman, the transactional girlfriend says, oh, you're my best friend, but they've only known each other for 2 days. That whole idea of you're someone's best friend after they've only met you for a day or two, very much sort of what we could, it's part of the sort of whole superficial universe that can sometimes be a part of narcissism. So now the gun is in the picture, right? Like it's always like this evolving mystery. And if you've watched multiple seasons, you know kind of how the show goes. So now we see the gun. You see the hapless security loves guard who's lovesick, who doesn't, I don't know if he's upright or what his story is, but now there's the gun. And even though the dad who is the finance guy who's going to get in trouble and it's going to lose everything. It's an interesting storyline with that dad, because now we're seeing a guy who is probably typically a grandiose narcissist, master of the universe type, about to get cut down, to lose everything. That is where, in fact, we can really see strong reactions and sometimes lethal reactions when a narcissistic person is about to lose everything, right? So it tracks this idea that he may harm himself using that gun. Dad doesn't seem like he'd harm someone else, but he does seem like potentially he could harm himself, given because he doesn't want to go to prison, that he's going to lose everything, that he has to tell his family, on and on and on. I personally think that's not the way it's going to go with Dad. I think that Dad's going to try to stay in Thailand, because he was talking all those tax cheats on that yacht. I think he might try to stay in Thailand and maybe stay in hiding, or maybe stay with the daughter. But now the gun's in play, right? I'm going to double down. I know it's too easy. It feels like low-hanging fruit. I think the way it's going to go, you know how I always end these videos. What do I think is going to happen? I'm holding the line on Greg being the one who's going to get the gun. He's already researching Belinda online. Belinda's clear. It's him. It was so interesting to see though that Belinda for the first time finally learned that what happened to Tanya. She didn't know. Why would she have checked? Right? So now she knows that Tanya was killed in Sicily last season and that they were trying to question her husband. So she now and she saw the picture. So she's putting the pieces together. But so too is he. You know, it's kind of, again, I said this in the last video about the last episode, is that Greg's play, showing up to another White Lotus property, is a little bit of a psychopath's play. Like you would think, you've taken the money, you've ran, you've created this sort of evil villain's lair in Thailand. You just want to stay underground, but instead you're almost showing up at the chain that was sort of the scene of the crime, right? There's something kind of, again, crime, sort of like the way a killer would keep a trophy sort of thing about that. So the question then becomes whether he is going to he's going to try to kill Belinda. It seems like he wants to take Belinda out, and he's been emboldened by getting away with the crime of ending Tanya's life, right? So, and again, it also sets this foreshadowing of like Thailand is a place for people to hide, which sets up that father trying the finance father potentially trying to stay. But I personally think that what might happen is Greg is probably going to try to recruit those goony guys who are mean to the security guard. They may try to recruit them. He might try to recruit them to end Belinda's life. Again, because he's psychopathic, he's not going to do it himself. But, and I think, and then we're going to lose him, right? Because if he gets caught. But it makes me wonder how long they're going to keep this character alive. Like somehow you got to keep Tanya alive on the show. But I think keeping Belinda alive would be a better way to do that. So my gut is that Greg may want to end Belinda's life, but he ends up not actually ending her life. But the whole scene unfolds, and then that sort of the love-struck cop who already has lost the gun, who's already let the robber into the place, like is already getting into a bit of trouble, that the cop gets killed by Greg in trying to protect Belinda. And I think it could be something like that. Or better yet, this is how I think it could go down. Those goon bully guys are trying to kill Belinda. He saves Belinda, and then Greg still stays clean from the crime. So that's my thought on this episode, that I think that it's going to involve Greg, but from a distance, just like in season 2, and that ultimately Belinda won't meet her end, but I think that poor cop might. He sort of feels like a Melville hero in this whole story. Anyhow, them's my thoughts. Every week the show does not disappoint with the narcissism, and but like, again, that one storyline with the vulnerable narcissistic guy and the trauma background and the girlfriend and then the family, that's really where my eyes are going. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I know it certainly brightens up my Sunday night and sets me up for the week. Bye.